Hello, everybody. Welcome to MHTV. We've got an amazing one tonight for you. As you can see, we've got a ton of guests. We're going to be talking about Radical Mental Health Zines. We're going to be talking about Asylum Magazine, all these different really interesting and innovative and actually been going for a long time projects. So I'll hand you to Vanessa, who'll tell you how you can join in and share with us.
Hello, everyone. As Nicky says, we're really looking forward to tonight's chat and we hope that you'll join in. If you've not joined us before, then head over to Facebook and like the Unite MHHE page, and you'll see the live feed, and you can comment in there and follow the conversation and watch it live. If you prefer Twitter, just go onto Twitter, find MHTV hashtag, and I'll be tweeting there throughout the conversation, sharing highlights. You can ask any questions, comments, join the discussion generally. We love to have a conversation. We love people's questions, so do ask any questions. And I'll hand you back over to Nicky.
Fantastic. So I'll come to our guests one by one and let you introduce yourselves. It's always a bit creepy if somebody else introduces you because you never quite recognise yourself. So I'll come to you one by one. Just tell me a little bit about yourself. So Helen, can we come to you first?
Yeah. Hi. So I'm Helen Spandler. I'm a Professor of Mental Health Studies at University of Central Lancashire, and I'm Editor of Asylum Magazine and the Principal Investigator of a new research project about MadZines. Radical Mental Health Zines.
Fantastic. Jill, can I come to you next?
Yeah, hi, I'm Jill Anderson. I live in Lancaster. I work with Helen and Tamsin on the MadZines project as a researcher. And I'm on the editorial group of Asylum Magazine, so we overlap in both those ways. I've got a background in social work education, and did an English degree originally, so I've kind of moved around a bit, and I'm involved in a mental health discussion group in Lancaster called CCRaMHP, which I can say a bit more about later.
Fantastic. Tamsin.
I'm Tamsin. I'm a PhD student on the same project, and I suppose my background, I've come through sort of voluntary sector, service user-led mental health services. Oh,
Fantastic.
And creative stuff.
Yeah, fantastic. We're already getting our first questions in. What is a zine is the first one, which I think takes us into thinking about Asylum, because it's a big anniversary for Asylum this year. Tell us a bit about that, Helen.
Yeah, so Asylum Magazine was launched in spring 1986. So it's our 35-year anniversary this month. So yeah, it's quite an achievement really that we've been going for this long. And we started off, this is our first ever issue that's very precious. It's in its plastic still. Issue 1 with an exclusive interview with R.D. Lang, a very famous anti-psychiatrist. So it kind of started as a bit like a zine. And we'll talk a little bit more about zines, but it really started, it was sort of influenced by three main things. One was the Italian democratic psychiatry movement, where they closed down the asylums and tried to develop a more democratic mental health system. It was also influenced by the emerging anti-psychiatry movement that was that was kind of at its height at that point, I guess, or maybe waning a little bit. And also the psychiatric survivor movement. So 1986, when Asylum was born, was also the time of a number of organisations that started at that year. So Survivors Speak Out, one of the first mental health survivor organisations. The Bristol Crisis Service for Women also started in 1986. There's a number of organisations. So we were part really of a groundswell in sort of critical or radical mental health organisations and movements. And we've been going ever since. We've had a few years where we haven't been able to be produced for a number of reasons, which is why the issue now is actually, the new issue's out this week. So any subscribers will get their copy, I think, on Friday this week. It should be landing on people's doorsteps on Friday. I haven't got it in my hand because I haven't got a copy yet. But yeah, and that's really Asylum.
Yeah. So when you're talking about radical mental health, what's radical about it?
That's a very good question. It's something we wrestled with for a long time. And I guess what we used to be called the Magazine for Democratic Psychiatry because we were influenced by the Italian movement for democratic psychiatry. But we got a lot of criticisms from mental health activists and MAD activists and psychiatric survivors. And we decided to move towards being called the magazine, the Radical Mental Health Magazine. We wanted to distance ourselves just being concerned with psychiatry, and we wanted to make it more radical. So I guess the idea of it is that it brings together different voices that are the voices you wouldn't normally hear in mainstream mental health debates. So there's a lot of, for example, now you hear a lot about let's talk about mental health problems or mental health stigma or recovery, things like that, which are all good things. We're not necessarily against those things, but we try and have the magazine to include voices that aren't usually heard in mainstream sort of media. So we include voices from sort of survivors and activists, and also from grassroots workers as well, and other people whose voices might not be heard very much. So we have a variety of different sort of, we don't really have a party line, but we think it's radical in itself to have different voices in dialogue with each other. So that, I guess that's what's radical or critical. And we've sort of helped to launch MAD studies as well as a sort of critical discipline or anti-discipline in relation to madness and distress. So it's really up for grabs what radical is, I think.
Yeah.
It's partly...
So what are you proudest about when you look at, because it's, I mean, I love Asylum. I started reading it, when I was a student, always getting hold of copies of it. And for me, it really helped me think about why I wanted to be a nurse and what kind of nurse I didn't want to be. That really, really helped me, because there were things that I came across in Asylum, ideas that I was never taught, or things that I'd seen in practice that I didn't know were wrong until somebody, my service user, was given the space to say, you stop doing that. It's very, very unhelpful indeed. You're making me feel sicker. But oh, well, then I'll stop doing that. So there was lots of stuff, I think, when you actually have that kind of debate, and you see that kind of, you hear someone's heart speaking, that their experience speaking, you just take it on board. And you just change, because it changes you whether you mean to or not. And I think there's something about Asylum that meant a great deal, or means a great deal to me. But I wondered about you guys. What does it mean to you to be engaged in Asylum? What are you proudest of about it? Anyone, go for it.
Because as the current editor, I'll be a bit sort of biased, I think.
And just to say, Nicky, that when we go to book fairs and things with Asylum, people quite often come up and say things very much along the lines you just said.
I say that.
And I think for me, it is something about creating a space where people can have conversations and discussions on a level. There's a kind of equality about the space, which so that an example of what Helen was just talking about, I think, is recently, for instance, we had a psychologist and somebody that she was working with as a service user, both writing about their experience in pieces that kind of spoke to each other. And I can imagine that students, current students or practitioners might find it really helpful to be able to read those kind of exchanges, which don't always happen. There isn't always space for them in other contexts. And I think the other thing I would say about it is, I think there's something about Asylum that is I suppose I would say slow. Things are slowed down, so it's an actual physical publication, unlike Twitter or other kinds of social media. People can't immediately respond. Sometimes it's several months. Sometimes people send a letter in. They might put a comment on the website, but it kind of creates, I think, a different kind of space for thinking as well as dialogue.
Absolutely. Tamsin.
Well, I'm not involved in Asylum in the same way. I mean, I've kind of had sort of different contacts with it over the years. So like when I was first aware of it was when I was part of a group called Women at the Margins. And we sort of did an edition of Asylum. That one there. It's like we planned it, but actually we didn't.
At home as well, I've got that edition.
Yeah. And so that was sort of when I was first aware of it, but then I've kind of done bits of stuff for it. I think that I really like the stuff that Jill was saying about the slowness. Like, I think people get into a lot of arguments online, and that kind of immediacy prevents people from just stopping and thinking and creating. So yeah, I think that's one of the things I like about it.
Definitely. So there's something about the kind of medium that it is that's different, and the space that it creates is different. What were you going to say, Helen? Sorry, I interrupted you.
Sorry, yeah, I was just going to say one of the things I'm increasingly wanting to do more of, and as a group we're trying to do more of, and I'm proud of, is the more of the creative work that we've included in the magazine more recently, over the last sort of 10 years or so. A lot of cartoons and creative work and that sort of overlaps with the zine stuff, rather in the first few years of Asylum, it used to be really long-winded articles, long text-based articles, which were quite academic. So I've really, since I've been the editor, I've really tried to make it much more diverse in terms of types of material, and making it much more visual as well, and engaging with different senses. The visual as well as the head and the heart, I guess. And we've had some fantastic zinesters and cartoonists like Tamsin and various other people who've done some fantastic work for us that's really brought the magazine to life, I think.
When we're talking about a zine, what are we talking about? I can see that there's another person going, will you say what a zine is? All right.
It's a very difficult question to answer. Yeah. Basically, a zine is a DIY produced booklet of some sort. It could be anything. So Asylum could be said to be a zine, but classically they're kind of smaller DIY hand-produced. They're not-for-profit. They're low circulation. Yeah. And we actually Jill actually produced a zine, an Asylum zine. So we turned Asylum Magazine into a little this is called a mini zine.
Yeah.
So it's one page, this is just one A4 page turned into a little mini zine. But zines can come in so many different shapes and sizes. And they can be anything. So it's really hard to say what a zine is. And in fact, lots of people there's a huge debate about what zines are.
It's beautiful. I love them.
Classic things are perzine, which is a personal zine, which is where somebody does a zine based on their personal experience. But there's also collectively produced zines, like this one from Recovery in the Bin.
Yeah.
They produced, sorry, it's upside down. Yeah. Produced a zine, which has lots of different people writing in it.
Yeah. And we'll be trying to put some links to these up if you're looking on Twitter. So don't worry, we'll get them up.
So this is Recovery in the Bin zine, and there's another really good one by Dear GP.
Yeah.
If you've seen this is a fantastic zine where people write stuff about their contact with health clinicians.
Yes, lots to be learned from, I think, in Dear GP.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's not really easy to say what a zine is, but hopefully we've shown a little bit of what zines could be.
Can I add a couple of things, Helen? One is, I think zines are often, they're generally not for profit and low circulation, and they're generally, the person who has written it or the people who write it are generally in control of the whole process, from the first idea through writing it, creating it, publishing it, distributing it. So generally there wouldn't be a publisher involved. And in that sense, they're often very rooted in people's lived experience in one way or another. Not all, they're about a variety of things. So we're interested in, I guess, the whole mental health, madness, distress area, but there are also art zines and stories and zines about anything. Yeah.
It's a really interesting thing, isn't it? Because I remember first seeing zines when I was a student some years ago in Manchester, and you'd find them in like pub and club toilets where people would like almost, you know, just like obviously come out with a load of them on a night out and just leave them everywhere they happen to have gone. And I used to love them. Now, I don't know how I'd feel about picking up a load of stuff in a toilet, but at the time, I never really thought about it.
I mean, they kind of have different routes. People sort of, there's all sorts of debates and arguments about where they started, but they certainly started sort of in the underground kind of alternative scene. So that definitely the girl zines in relation to sort of feminism, and also punk zines were quite famous. And also, of course, football zines, fan zines were quite big as well. So they were, and the classic thing about them was that you had the official programme from a football match, supporters who made their own fanzines, which were much more honest. So you had the official, football club line, but the actual zines were much more interesting because that was what supporters really thought.
But that's isn't that true? The truth is always way more interesting, isn't it?
Yeah, and that's why zines are so interesting to us, is because I think they offer a route into something perhaps more truthful or authentic or real compared to the official mental health discourse and policy that we often hear.
The sorts of things that it makes me think of are those kind of like 18th century kind of scandal rags where the truth is told whether you like it or not on handbills. They're just printed out, and there's a real tradition of that. But also it links into the stuff that's going on now with sort of craftivism, with that kind of maker culture. And all of a sudden, I'm seeing a lot more. I know at our university, we're starting to collect them, particularly the health ones, because they're so interesting and they provide such a really important counterpoint, I think, to sort of more traditional research. It's a different type of experience, isn't it? So what do you guys think is going on that people are so much more interested now than they were, perhaps? Because you guys have got a project as well, which we probably should come around to.
It's the MadZines Research project. And I mean, I think personally, it's something to do with people are quite tired of the digital. And you know what Jill and Tamsin were saying earlier about the kind of instant and argument stuff that gets played out online a lot. And I think what zines offers is something more personal, something more creative, and something less that's the digital world. Because what happens is you can send off for them on like Etsy and various craft shops, and then you actually receive them in the post with like a little note from the zine maker. I mean, Tamsin, this morning I got some from Tamsin. Tamsin sends me her zines, and I got a little packet today of Tamsin zines, which I opened. It is so lovely to get these, handcraft with a little message in them, and even got a chocolate bar with it.
I'm in.
And that's classic of what you get with zine, which is so different from engaging on digital stuff, because it feels quite alienating sometimes. So I think it's something about getting back something of what we've lost. Personally, that's how I feel about it anyway.
And I think just somebody mentioned, I think, young people, and there are lots of projects doing zine making with young people recently. And I think one thing certainly that's been around in Lancaster has been a sense that a lot of the youth activities were quite geared up to things like sport. I mean, as well as the computer thing, very sort of active sporting activities and things, and that there was a bit of an appetite for making things, which may link to your craftivism idea, Nicky, but I think generally over the last few years there's been a lot more kind of knitting, sewing, those kind of activities, and a recognition that some young people are quite hungry for things, that developing a space where they can do things like that.
Definitely.
Yeah. It's was just going to say, it's like that embodied kind of tactile nature of it. You know, it's not just that people own it and that they can kind of set the agenda, and that they can shape the whole physical being of the zine around the idea, or they kind of can mesh together and create at the same time. But it's also that it's a solid physical thing. At the end of the day, you've made something, you know, that you can go, look, I've done this, and it's very real. Whereas you know, all the stuff online, it feels very disconnected, you know, disembodied sometimes, isn't it?
We're going to come to Vanessa in a minute, but I think perhaps before we do that, just hear what everyone's saying. But before we do that, maybe you could tell us a little bit about the project itself. So what is it that you've set up to do and what you're hoping to find?
Shall I start and do chip in? So our project, it's funded by the Wellcome Trust. And the three of us are working on it, but we're working alongside a kind of quite a diverse group of people who make zines or have an interest in zines. And our aim is really to explore this whole, I suppose, what we've identified as a range of MadZines. So zines which are which deal in different ways with people's experiences of madness and distress, but come at mental health perhaps from a slightly different angle. And I think the discussion about asylum perhaps gives a sense of the kinds of angles that those might be. So those kinds of zines which have a critical, perhaps challenging approach that are trying to look at different ways of understanding and exploring mental health. Nobody has yet really, I suppose, described them as a distinct category of zines. So there's been, for instance, people have looked at, have seen that there are a group of zines that are based on people's personal experience called perzines, as Helen mentioned, or there might be, you know, people have recognised particular categories of, I don't know, feminist zines or art zines. But we have just tentatively, I suppose, we're interested in this idea that there is a group of zines which we're calling MadZines, which have this kind of critical approach. And what we're interested in doing is we're collecting them. So we're really interested, if anybody has got any examples, please have a look at our website, see how we're describing them and engage with us about that, or send us some.
We'll be tweeting that and we'll put it on the Facebook link.
Right.
So if you do have anything or you do know of anybody, please hook them up, because it's really important, I think, to gather this stuff, because maybe we will lose it if we don't, and that would be really sad.
So we're hoping to work with existing. There are some existing archives. We'd like to be going and sitting in them and looking at zines. That hasn't been possible, but we're hoping to identify these and then perhaps to work with archives for them to hold them. We're also so we're reading them, we're thinking about what it is that they do and how they challenge these ideas. What are the ideas that are in them? And I think perhaps I'll stop in a minute and let other people chip in, but I think an important thing is that we are particularly interested, I suppose, not just or not specifically in, we're not trying to analyze, what it is that.
So not content analysis.
Yeah, so we're more interested in what the zines are doing, because we think they're doing very interesting things. And in the ways that you mentioned about picking them up in the pub loos or whatever, zines move around. They're small and they move around very easily. Yeah. And they can be left in places, and they could be put in the pages of a book or left on a bus. So we're kind of interested in their power to shift ideas around and get discussions moving. So
I like the way they could sneak into people's lives. I like that. That's a nice thing.
Yeah. Yeah.
Is there anything else that you guys wanted to say, particularly about the project, before we come to Vanessa? And then I think we do need to, at some point as well, to come to you, Tamsin, separately, perhaps, just to talk about your work as well. So anything about the website and the project?
So we're kind of updating the website at the moment, and we're adding stuff to it all the time. Jill's just made a great video about the because the other thing we're actually doing is we're co-producing new zines as well. Jill and Tamsin are both making lots of zines. Yeah, and the one that Jill's holding up was the one we did initially for the project. That was we did a project proposal to get funding for this, and Jill turned it into a zine. And we've done that a lot. And also, for example, we've got our methodology that Jill turned our methodology into a zine, which is fantastic. We're trying to practice what we preach rather than just analyze them. We're trying to sort of have a MadZine methodology, if you like, a way of doing research that is that sits comfortably with both MAD studies, if you like, a MAD kind of approach, a critical mental health approach, and also a zine that's sensitive to zine and zine culture and zine making as well, which has been a real challenge, but we're really kind of excited about developing these ideas and finding out where it takes us.
And I think just to add that's, it's not that we're trying to somehow muscle in on zine culture, but it's more that we're finding that through the process of making zines, that I suppose what Tamsin was talking about, the very embodied nature of actually making them and also sharing them, I think that's helping us develop a different kind of understanding than we would if we were just kind of sitting there studying them. So I was telling Helen earlier that I produced this rather personal zine and was involved in a zine swap, which is quite a feature of zine culture. And it involved me sending the hard copy of my zine to somebody else in Canada. And the idea was they would send their zine back, but they never did. And I never knew whether they received mine. And I think the understanding that I gained from that, of something around that swapping, what that means, was very different from just reading about other people's.
There's a real vulnerability in it, isn't it? When you share your personal information or the heart of how you feel about something, that suddenly, and you invest time and effort in it, all of a sudden it becomes absolutely concrete, doesn't it? That emotion. Wow, that's really interesting, isn't it? And also, I think putting your methodology in a zine might actually mean that someone reads it, which never happens to people's research methodologies, ever. Everyone skips that bit. They just look at it, see if it looks sort of okay, straight on to the next bit. So can we come to Vanessa briefly before we... So I appreciate you've got to nip back off a second.
Yeah.
Vanessa?
Yeah. I mean, on Twitter, there's a lot of support, certainly for Asylum and people who are, sharing their own lived experiences of how it's been useful for them. There was a comment about how, the ambivalence in Asylum about mental health, which, somebody's commented was really useful in terms of their experience. One of the things that I think is interesting as well is, and I know you said that you're not looking at the content of zines specifically, but I think the sort of historical context of them will be quite useful, won't it, as time goes on? Because thinking about what Nicky was saying at the beginning, and I share that, when I went into mental health nursing back in the early 1990s, I remember thinking, wow, a lot of the people I knew, including relatives who had, serious mental health difficulties, these people in hospital are being seen as sort of somebody very different to the people that I know in my life, who are human beings who have interesting lives and strengths. And, the medical culture at the time was very, very reductionist and very focused on people being ill and the deficit of illness, wasn't it? And then I think a discovery for me was social media and Twitter, definitely being able to have those democratic conversations with people, whether you work in services or you've got mental health difficulties, or, you know, both, which is often the case. But as you say, recently it's got more negative and at times quite toxic online, hasn't it? And I totally get where you're coming from about the zines providing some sort of more positive response on things. And so that got me thinking about history and where we'll be, you know, in another 10 years, really. And whilst you're not looking at the content specifically now, I think that'll be really interesting in a few years' time. Have you thought about that, had those conversations yourselves?
I mean, the project is a 3-year project, but I'm sure that we'll carry on thinking about this, hopefully for many, many years. But we've not really thought too much about the future, really. I guess, you know, there is something about zine culture that's very of the moment. And I think it's partly because of the rise of new forms of marginalised identities. Trans people, non-binary people, neurodiverse people, you know, who've been marginalised in the past and maybe now, you know, are starting to have more of a voice or more of a platform, and people who are sort of out with the main, so they might be the lesbian and gay movement or whatever, and people who may feel slightly outside of that, or the mainstream mental health service movement, people who feel slightly outside of that. So it's sort of increasing the diversity of people's voices. So I guess it depends what happens with those subcultures and what happens with mainstream and different experiences and identities, really, to a certain extent, what happens to zines. So I guess who knows, really?
Yeah, who knows? Yeah, I think that in itself is interesting, isn't it? That it's allowing marginalised voices to be heard, because we know that in history we often don't hear what happened from a sort of marginalised perspective. We get the mainstream perspective. So, you know, it is collecting a sort of historical voice and a different voice, isn't it, about mental health? So, yeah.
I do have some questions coming through. If you ready for them? You ready? You both? So thank you very much, Mike. I keep saying Mike and Grant, that it always reminds me of EastEnders, and I keep saying Rise Above It, Nicky, in my head. And then I don't. So we've got Michael Ramsey and Grant Fraser-King from last week, who talked so brilliantly about empathy, saying, one, he's using one of Helen's papers in the year 1 material. So get ready, Helen, to be misquoted by first years. Lovely. Hello, first years. Then this idea, Adina's talking about being ambivalent about madness is really important. It's a really key thing to have that. Michael, I want to know, is there a positive reaction to the creative content? His experience is that they provoke a positive but qualitatively different reaction when he shares them in class. And I wondered what you thought, if you noticed them getting a different response.
Zines, do you mean? Do you want to say anything, Tamsin, about that?
Well, I don't know that what I was going to say is entirely helpful, but I was just going to say that, so I've, yeah, okay. I was just going to say that what I have, so I've done quite a lot of talks where I wanted to use zines for like handouts and stuff. And so when I've given them as handouts after doing talks or lectures or whatever, people have kind of looked at me like, what you give me this for? It's not a book. It's not a reading list. It's it's not. So they didn't really see the value in it, I think. But yeah.
But that's
just to say, I wonder if the context is quite important, because I've certainly found when I've been handing out leaflets about asylum, I have a sense like people just leave them, or, you know, I've got a sense they stuff them in their bag. But actually, when we were distributing the zines, there's something people sometimes just really seize on them, and there's something that feels more like something valuable in that exchange. And I found with students that carries over. So I think I found that similar reaction, that people quite value them. Yeah.
So some people value them, some people really don't know quite where to put them in their heads. Like, what am I being given? I can see it's important because it's personal, but I don't know what to do with it.
Yeah. I suppose traditionally in academia, you know, everything's text has been really valued, and images haven't been, and things like that. So, and one of the things that really attracts me to zines is that I'm getting quite tired of reading long-winded text-based, heavy theoretical articles, you know, some of which are brilliant, but some of which, you know, you can kind of quite turgid at times. And I love the fact that zines can condense such critical, interesting, unsettling, challenging ideas in such a simple but beautiful way. And I guess it depends on what you're looking for. And also people learn in different ways. Some people learn visually, some people learn by text, some people learn lots of different ways. So I guess that's part of our engagement with them.
It's like they've got an intrinsic value, but people don't necessarily see that because we're not taught to value the type of document that they are.
Yeah.
So it's interesting when you think, so who is the person writing for?
Yeah.
And if they're writing for a bunch of people who can't understand what they're talking about, then they're not. You know, it's really interesting. Now you look at a lot of the research that's coming out. I saw a fantastic piece of research the other day that was about young people's lives and gentrifying South London, which, if it was written up, would have been boring as. But the young people involved had done this really creative project. They'd done a zine about how they'd undertaken the research, what they'd found, what their lives were like, and what they thought about their homes and the place where they lived, just changing around them with no reference to them at all. And I know it's going to stay with me. It was beautiful and it was important and it was heartbreaking and it was, you know, and I can't remember the last time I read a research paper and came across thinking, this is heartbreaking and beautiful and important. I was like, I don't know what that word means. So there's something, if you want to communicate, you have to think about who you want to communicate to. Grant said something here about the narrative is important, but how it's produced also creates a really strong message, which I think is echoing what you guys were saying. Yeah. I've got a couple more questions, or did you want to take them, Vanessa?
No, carry on. Yeah.
On a right chatting.
I'm in the flow of it. I'll chip in.
I've got a great one from Stephen, and it's a bear with me, it's a long one, but it's a good one. Does the panel think that zines or other radical publications or mediums actually contribute or challenge the echo chambers in mental health psychiatry?
That's a good one.
The answer came in the medium of wry smiles and worried, concerned eyes. So I reckon both was where we're going to end up. Did anyone want to take that one?
My view is that there's echo chambers everywhere. Psychiatry has its own echo chamber, and there are other echo chambers too. You know, sort of even in critical mental health stuff, I think there are echo chambers, you know, critical psychiatry or critical psychology or mad studies and all that sort of stuff. I think that can often happen. And I guess what I like about zines is they're not necessarily signed up to any party line or any sort of particularly professional grouping or academic grouping or anything like that. So I'm hopefully they can challenge all kinds of different echo chambers and create some sort of dialogue between them, which is where we sort of started out.
Yeah, there can be something really elitist though, can't there, as well, about writing and who gets to write and whether you're good enough to write and what will get published and what won't. So I can imagine from a social class point of view, looking at sort of mental health, you know, and the intersections, that it gives people an opportunity to have their say, regardless of whether they're really good writers. You know, some people, as you say, might be really good at producing a cartoon and talking about their experiences that way. It's not really about how good you are at writing. It's about, you know, what you want to say and sharing your experiences. So I can see them really sort of challenging the status quo in that sense as well. I think that so many people, you know, have got so much to say, but you never hear their thoughts. You never see anything written by them because not everyone feels that they can write or that they get the opportunity. So.
You've got a devil's advocate question. Oh, go on. Do you finish what you're going to say?
Oh, I was just going to say that I think from being a bit immersed in them, that a lot of their power does come from the sort of the fact that they're not very finished and polished, and that goes for the production of them, but also the messages of them are not all polished, tied up. They're not saying, you know, this is my argument and it places me on that side of this or that side. They're often confusing, quirky. You might not quite know where they're coming from, but there's something powerful about that.
Yeah, it's like a conversation instead of a speech, isn't it?
Yeah,
I like that.
Yeah,
exactly. I think what can happen in mental health services as well is sort of the whole recovery narrative, which is very powerful and works for some people, but for some people it doesn't. And I think things like zines allow a space for different experiences that don't fit within the accepted narrative of whether it's recovery or whatever it is. I think zines allow things to be unfinished and not providing a nice conclusion or answer, but let's sit with that uncertainty and let's just sit with those feelings that, you know, and I think that's really important in mental health to be able to do that.
Yeah, and that echoes somebody's comment, doesn't it, as well, about ambiguity, and that's what their value. That totally fits with what you've just said, really. And the recovery narrative is great, but, you know, talking about social media again, you know, people are polarized, aren't they? And I've seen so many conversations where, you know, there's two very competing perspectives, and people lose sight of, you know, the person's experience in the middle of it, and it becomes a sort of academic argument about, you know, which discipline is right, which evidence is the correct evidence, rather than focusing on somebody's experience, which, as you say, might not have any conclusions. It's just somebody's experience and perspective. Does it need to have a theoretical background to it? You know, it can be just somebody's experience, and you know, often that's messy, isn't it? So.
And also, I think it's something about changing what we see as theory, because I think we tend to see theory as things that clever, usually white male people who write clever books and stuff like that. But actually, I think zinesters are theorists in their own way. They're creating new ways to think about something. Well, that's theory, as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah. We've got a devil's advocate question from Dina. So thank you very much for that one. And they're basically saying, you know, talking about academic. Exactly the thing you were talking about, that anxiety around academics honing in on somebody else's turf. They're saying, you know, where are the mad people in all this? Where are the mad people in your project? You know, so it's not just 3 academic women telling people about survivors' stories. But what's the response to that one?
Well, I think it's interesting that there's an assumption that none of us are mad, is my initial response. You know, I've worked in mental health services for 20 years, but, you know, I spent 10 years in services before I started working in them. I spent 10 years using services. So I always find that assumption interesting.
Definitely.
Yeah, it's interesting when we teach as well. So I remember teaching, and I can't remember the exact scenario, but teaching a load of social workers, and kind of, they always assume that when you're talking about mental health, people with mental health problems or mad people, that you're talking about a lot of people out there. But of course, everybody, you know, there's always going to be people in the room who've had mental health issues of some sort or other, however that's defined. And also, we're looking at a range of different things around neurodiversity, autism, trans experience, any experience that has been psychiatrized in some way. And I think we've probably all had something along those, or that could have been psychiatrized at some point in history, if not now. But also we're engaging with a lot of mad identified zinesters, the part of our project too. So yeah, but it's a good question, but yeah.
Absolutely. And Dina is happy with your answer, which is what the smiley little cheeky emoticon, which is great. Mick McEwen, hello Mick, says, could the panel say something about humour in zines, which is a great question because we've got humour coming up as a topic next week. So humour in zines, you guys. Are you funny? Is this funny?
Well, who wants to say something about that? I think not all zines are funny, for sure. But I think certainly the cartoon stuff we're interested in, the single panel cartoon stuff, that's kind of got me into this. Because one of the reasons I got into this project was through analysing the first 30 years of Asylum Magazine. And one of the things that I was really drawn to was the cartoons and images. And I wrote a whole chapter which included Tamsin's cartoons that she did for our special self-harm zine. And there was something quite humorous about those. Humorous, but in a good way, not just funny, but the way that she and others cartoonists had used humor to challenge and turn on its head some of our assumptions around certain things. Humor is a really important part of zines importance, but they're not all zines are though. I don't know if you want to say more about that, Tamsin, given you've...
That you can make this bit slow. Go on.
Old and humorous. Not my internet is unstable. I think my cartoons are funny, but other people might not necessarily.
I mean, there's certain zinesters that we're working with, like Dolly Sen,
hilarious,
who are classic. We'd call classic MadZinesters. Their zines are really funny, but they're also really moving and critical, and informative, and all those things. I think they're sort of classic MadZines.
She's properly rebellious in every way that it's something that you want to be, isn't it? So, I mean, her ability to cause trouble is just it's like an Olympic level gift of troublemaking. There's always the right kind of trouble that needs to be created. It's this really spectacular thing. Yeah, it's this idea that someone who's drawing a picture isn't communicating an important idea is madness. When you look at some of the I won't say the stunts, but some of the art she's created, it goes straight to the heart of the matter in a way that thousands of words wouldn't do.
And we're through this project, we're linking Dolly, for instance, into a group in Lancaster that Helen and I have both been involved with. And we've been having a lot of discussion over recent months about the kind of the pressures, the way in which society pressurizes people to fit into certain ways and a certain idea of normality, and how difficult it can be to resist that, and in different ways people in the group have been struggling with that. So bringing Dolly into that to help us think about how we can be more subversive, if you like, and how what she's learned about that is feeling really fruitful, and I think we're moving some zines around as part of that, and some of those use humour in really powerful ways.
Mm-hmm. I think the word gasoline and fire are coming to my mind, but okay, let's see how it turns out. Helen, go on.
We did a piece from Dolly in the last issue of Asylum, not the current one that's coming out, the previous one, about her action to section the Department of Work and Pensions.
Perfect. That made me laugh my head off when I saw that. I laughed till I cried when I first saw that.
It's such a Dolly Sen thing to do. Only Dolly could have thought of it, but it's such a brilliant idea.
Was it to be a danger to themselves and others? I was like, beautiful. Beautiful. My favourite of all was the TripAdvisor of the Maudsley, which will never stop being funny, because I would have hated that to happen to me, but I totally think it's kind of funny that it happened to anyone else. I wonder, Tamsin, is your internet good enough to tell us a bit about your project before we start think about winding up and wrapping up for tonight?
I don't know, I'll give it a go. Yeah, so basically the stuff I'm doing is about the processings, and I'm mostly focusing on women, especially sort of women of colour, working class women, people who are not, who you don't hear from. And I'm talking to people who are already making zines and sharing zines, who sort of mental health activists or survivor activists, and going to be doing some making workshops with people, and then sort of talking to them about what that's been like and see what they make.
Fantastic.
And it's come from being frustrated. So I bring together all these sort of different things. So I've got the kind of art side, and I've got, I have the sort of 10 years as a service user, 20 years working in services, and a frustration about service user involvement and the way that it tends to be centred around the needs of services as opposed to the needs of people using services or who might use services, and about the use of language. So the expectation that people use quite a professional language and wear like office wear and talk in a meeting or a conference, instead of going, well, how do you want to communicate with me. What shape do you want your narrative to be? What language do you want to use? So it's kind of come out of that, really. And I think there's a lot of potential in zines in terms of people's personal message and connecting sort of personal and political together, but also that kind of linking with other people. And, community is really important in terms of mental health.
Definitely.
But also in terms of people having a voice.
Yeah. Absolutely. Is there anywhere that people can see your work, or as it's developing, or hear what you're saying, or join in some way?
We've got on the website, we've got one of my comics, which is sort of about what I'm doing. So presumably, and then we've got MadZine on Instagram as
Fantastic.
Well.
Yeah, we'll make sure that gets sent out. Thank you very much. Much appreciated. I guess we'll run out of time. Just as I'm actually getting ready to settle down and really start digging into this, it's time for us to stop, which is always the way. But if this is a subject you're really interested in, and the people who are watching and you want to hear more of it, just let us know. That's no problem. And also, as a lot of us will check back over the Twitter feed and the Facebook live feed, and we'll put links in where we can to things that you might want to follow up on as well. But I guess we need to go round to one and all. Can we start with Vanessa? Is there anything that I've missed or anything that you wanted to add?
Yeah, no, just to say thank you. I mean, it's been a really fascinating conversation tonight, and I'll be looking up certainly on the Instagram and the website, and we'll be sharing links, because I'm sure there'll be lots of people wanting to get involved, and conversation just seems to be developing, as we often find. So we'll keep an eye on the Twitter feed as well, and we'll answer anybody's questions or refer on to yourselves if we can. But I think, as Nicky says, maybe this is a conversation that we do need to come back to as things develop, and really interested, and particularly interested, as you've said, and it's come across strongly, about how we get different voices heard. Tamsin, your project sounds brilliant, particularly about getting working class voices heard, because that's something that people don't talk about. We talk a lot about marginalised groups, but we don't often talk about working class voices, do we? And I think that's really important, and really interested to see how that develops as well. So yeah, thank you everybody. That's it from me, really.
Helen, is there anything you wanted to add?
Well, no. I mean, if people want to make some MadZines, or have made MadZines and want to send them to us, we'd love to receive them. And if people want to contribute to Asylum Magazine as well, let us know, or subscribe. Follow us on Zines Mad on Twitter. Keep track of our website, and it'd be lovely to hear from people. Absolutely. Jill?
Yeah, I think just picking up on that discussion about zines as a more rough-edged way of knowing, I think there's a load of pressure often in universities, and coming sometimes from students as well, that we have to the ideas have to be kind of all very packaged and neat, and that there is somehow a truth out there that we need to get to. So I'm particularly interested in the usefulness of zines in teaching, how they can be used and created with and by students, and also how the ideas in zines can be moved around in universities. So if there's anybody out there who's using them or interested in that, or has ideas about that, I'd be very, very interested to talk.
Absolutely. Tamsin?
I don't know that I've got anything else to add.
It's not the law. You have to. Should we finish up then? Just to say that obviously International Women's Day is coming up soon. Yes. And Vanessa and I are going to be doing some stuff for that, as I think tons of people are. And that's another thing that's changed, isn't it? I remember in the 90s, you could barely get anyone to be involved in it at all. Now it's actually quite hard push to find somebody who isn't doing something on that day. So it's fantastic. Did you want to say anything about what's coming up for us on that day? Or should we treat it out later? It's up to you.
Yeah, no, just to say that we're doing a session, aren't we, next week on International Women's Day, and we've come up with a hashtag being women. So if you're on Twitter, what we'd love to hear is any comments, tweets about well-being, really, how, you know, your own self-care, what you do for well-being, and we want to feed those into the conversation next week. So just get in touch with us.
Maybe one of the things you'll be doing is making a zine now. So that's a good thing. So guys, thank you so much for your time tonight. It's a really interesting discussion. I've really enjoyed it. Thank you very much. Just best for us to say good night now. Night.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.